Hey, fellow comic book addicts. It's Sleepy Reader, Damien. I am here today with my comic book thoughts. Uh, I'll do it countdown style still. There was only 5 comics that I picked up this past Wednesday from my comic book store. It was the 5th week of September, I guess, and the 5th week is always a slow week where less stuff is released, often annuals if they have any. So stuff, at least that was on my pull list, there wasn't a lot of it. And it was a pretty flat, unexciting week too. Excuse me. Which goes to show, if for a lot of people picking up 5 comic books in a week would be a lot of comics, you can pick up 5 comics and easily end up with a pile of comics that aren't that exciting. So it's kind of a lot of work to find the good comics. I feel like one, I buy a lot of comics, and two, I've honed my way of finding comics that I will enjoy. So I was kind of disappointed that none of these really jumped out at me in a big way. I'd say the top 2 were quite good, but just lacked certain things to make them like comics that make me go, wow. So anyway, I thought on top of that, I'd show you some stuff that I have kind of trades and hardbacks and other stuff that I've picked up here and there over the last month or two that I just haven't shown in any videos. Just because I'm not allowed to do short videos, right? So here in at number 5, and really kind of disappointing, was Last Stop on the Red Line. I think this is actually the last issue in the series, and I read numbers 2, 3, and 4. This is number 4, all in a row, all together, and I still just did not understand what was going on. I felt like there were lots of cool elements from, this vampire and werewolf, who I don't think really are a vampire and werewolf, but are always drawn that way because one or more of the characters imagines them that way, or maybe I'm wrong. There's a buddy cop movie where one is a white guy from the suburbs and the other is a brown woman from the city. Why they're working together or anything like that, I didn't understand. What the case was, there were murders on the Red Line, but why they were going after various people and stuff never made sense to me. And our main character was this Yusef fellow. I never understood what was going on with him. It was all very interesting and intriguing. Maybe this needed to be a 12-issue series for it all to make sense. The art was great. The color was great. Interestingly, the color is by the writer, John Mayberry. Or someone Mayberry. Is it John? Paul Mayberry. And I'm pretty sure I've read other comics by Paul Mayberry that made sense to me. So I kind of feel like somehow it's my own stupidity. But, in the end, these are the last 2 pages. I had no idea what had happened. And I just felt very frustrated. And, no one likes it when books make them feel dumb, right? In this case, I don't know what happened. And it was one of those cranky moments where I thought, like, well, where was the editor? Why wasn't the editor reading this for us, pre-reading this for us readers and figuring out why it doesn't make sense and getting the writer to rewrite it? Because at least at Dark Horse, they do have editors. At Image, they often don't. But this was one of the most confusing comics I've read in a long time. Okay, and then there was at number 4, Hellblazer, which was written by Simon Spurrier and had fantastic art by Marcio Takara. I know I've seen the name Marcio Takara elsewhere, but I can't remember where. But I loved this art. The colors by Chris Peter were also really good. I did not care for this story a whole lot. It was an okay read. I feel like it hit a lot of the same notes about Hellblazer's character that we've been getting over and over again in all these sort of half-baked versions of Constantine during the New 52 and during Rebirth. Each one of which I've kind of sampled. And it seems like the purpose of this story, maybe in some way through multiverses and magic, to reposition Constantine into the quote Sandman universe that they're currently running as a Vertigo book. But now I guess this one's marked as Black Label, not as Vertigo. So maybe they'll all now be marked as Black Label. But anyway, as the Sandman universe, which is supposedly overseen by Neil Gaiman himself. So yeah, I just wasn't feeling it. The coolest thing was, and maybe this is something from a review I saw, maybe this was something that is also in Hellblazer, the old Hellblazer comics, that there's an older version of, so we got two versions of Mr. Constantine. One is kind of an older, relaxed bloke, you might say. I wish I could find a picture of him there. That's the older Constantine. But it didn't really make much sense to me. And it seemed like, and then I realized this is not the first issue of a series. Upcoming will be a first issue of a series. This was a one-shot that was just wasting my $4.99 to get me to understand why Hellblazer would be in the Sandman universe. Just have him in the Sandman universe. So I can't tell from this whether I'm going to like the Hellblazer in the Sandman universe, but it's not a great first sign for me. I liked much more at number 3, Man or Black, number 4. I think I read somewhere or heard Colin Bunn say somewhere that this is done a bit like a soap opera. And I can see that in the pacing. The pacing is kind of low key. Like, even though there's some pretty wild action in this issue, it often feels like it's not like the normal comic book that kind of wants to be in your face more. It's a little bit more laid back, even though it's in this world of all kinds of magic competition. So it's not competition is the wrong word, but conflict between different groups. I love the art by Tyler Crook, and I'm very interested in the story. I kind of wish there was a little more explanation for things, particularly the scope of this magic. I guess we have kind of a magic fire element that's controlled by one person, and it's a question of who controls it. And I assume that our kind of titular main character, this older man, one of the blacks, I forget what his first name is, but he's the patriarch of the black family. I assume he controls some magical element too, but I forget what. But anyway, this is very pleasurable. Funny that it comes right ahead of Constantine, but as a sort of horror book about magic wielders, it is so much better than my number 3 book. My number 4 book. So in at number 3. I almost thought about putting it at number 1. I shuffled them back and forth. But I decided I personally had more fun reading what I did put at number 2 and number 1. So I put the 5th issue, the final issue of Silver Surfer Black, in at number 4. It was not my number 1 comic because I was frustrated by the writing and concepts. The artwork just outdid itself. This is a 5 out of 5, a 5 plus, a 5 stars plus artwork. And I suppose through these 5 issues, Tradd Moore has really won us over with his crazy style. But I think he's also grown in these 5 issues, if I'm not mistaken. I'd have to go back and look. But it seems like the sophistication of the images and the panels has been growing. Now, he might have been saving that, saving his chops so that there was always something held back for the next issue, so each issue wows us a little more. But I felt a little irritated at the concept, which wasn't 100% clear to me, but I think the concept was that the Silver Surfer became the seed for the universe as we know it, because this is back in time in I guess, a universe kind of ruled by Null. Now, a baby or a newborn planet Ego exists, So it can only be so old unless Ego is as old as the universe. But anyway, that's nitpicking. And in the end, a little spoiler, the Silver Surfer is now all black rather than silver. So I don't know what they'll call him. Maybe the Black Rider, the Black Surfer. So anyway, it was cool and intriguing, and I'm interested how Donny Cates will use the Silver Surfer next. But maybe like last week when I complained about too many stories that were about the ultimate end of the universe, and this is about the ultimate beginning of the universe, it's almost too cosmic for me. And when you get too cosmic, it just seems a bit cheesy and too easy in a way. But I don't hold a whole lot against it. I really enjoyed this series. Just wish I understood it a little more, I guess, how all the pieces fit. And maybe if I had been reading Venom and other things where Null has been introduced into the Marvel Universe, I would have understood all of it a little better. And I will eventually read Venom. I'm just waiting. Perhaps foolishly, I waited. I didn't pick it up in single issues. Plan to read it eventually. So I'm calling my number one Savage Avengers Annual number 1. I wonder if there'll ever be a Savage Avengers Annual number 2. Will Savage Avengers be around in another year? But anyway, Savage Avengers has been a fun comic, and this issue was really cool, this annual. I suppose it's a bit of a side story, but I think it has a lot of elements in here that are going to come to play in future issues. And basically inadvertently teams up Damon Hellstrom, I'm not sure, and Conan the Barbarian and the Black Widow, who make a very fun team. They don't even know they're teaming up. Their paths collide. So it's more like how I would think the old Defenders was. And of course, Damon Hellstrom was often a big part of the Defenders. But this one also has great art. It's Ron Garney, and since he did Savage Sword of Conan, I am like a huge Ron Garney fan. I don't think he was quite as up to the brilliance of Savage Sword of Conan, maybe just because it was a different sort of story, having to take place in our world. The colors were quite good, but maybe I would like this better in black and white, because I like the Ron Garney blacks and whites, and I think it's best when the colorist restrains him or herself a bit more when they're coloring this style of heavy black art. But still, the colors were good. There was an incredibly cool picture of what Damon Hellstrom looks like when he's just hanging around in hell waiting for something to do. He's just floating in this vat of presumably lava with a giant fireworm writhing about him, and his butler telling him what's on the agenda. The one thing that struck me about this, my big thought about it, was this is a really cool, pulpy, very pulp kind of story, and I loved pulp as a kid, and I still enjoy it a lot. But I would hope I would not have read a story like this as a kid. It goes too deep into questions of the sexual abuse of prostitution and the slavery of prostitution. And that's kind of it's interesting when that's used mostly for pulpy purposes. I mean, there is a bit of a moral here, although it also is lost in the fact that Conan, while saving slaves and sort of kidnapped prostitutes, is a frequenter of prostitutes. And it even has the hoary kind of cliche of after you save the prostitutes, then they happily have sex with you. Anyway, kind of adultish stuff. More adult than a lot of stuff I see in Marvel Comics, who I think do a better job maybe than DC sometimes of being a more all-ages friendly comic book company. Anyway, I suppose, if I'd read this when I was 11 or 13, I might not have gotten all of the nuances and subtleties of the issue of prostitution and slavery, and maybe just passed over it without thinking about it and being disturbed by it. But cool issue, and so you kind of gathered there that a big part of the plot is stopping this slave ring, which is connected to plot elements from the main story in Savage Avengers. So I hope there's more Ron Garney turning up on something Savage in the Marvel comics. I just really love it when he's drawing an issue. I don't know. I think Patrick Zurcher is taking over the pencils for the main Savage Avengers comic. So that'll be interesting to see what he does there too. Okay, let me show you some. Oh, there's some people here. Okay, I'm back after a lengthy feeling delay. So I was about to show you some stuff that I've gotten. Just today, actually, I unwrapped, here's the plastic. I unwrapped I think it's the final deluxe volume of The Sixth Gun. Beautiful, oversized hardbacks. Here it is compared to a comic book size. And The Sixth Gun was a very special indie comic. Kind of stands out, kind of a unique thing. And what happened was I started out reading it in trades, in paperback trades. I think I read the first 3. And then I discovered these oversized hardbacks. And I liked it so much, I thought, well, I will get it in the oversized hardback instead. So I bought all the oversized hardbacks. And finally, the 6th one came out. And so I put off reading anymore. So now my plan is to go back and read all 6 volumes, which suddenly strikes me as kind of an unrealistic approach. But there you are. I want to savor the large size. It's also kind of unique as the ribbon is kind of, what is going on here? I'll just go to another page. It's unique that it's on matte paper. It was originally on glossy paper, so it probably changes the shades of the colors a bit, but it's also a very nicely colored. It's Brian Hurt and Colin Bunn, artist and writer, and then color artist Bill Crabtree. You can see there's a whole episode by Earl Grey on Bill Crabtree's colors, but a very distinctive comic book all around. The binding, I think, is sewn, but it's very tight. That's kind of my one complaint about these volumes. Maybe it will loosen up over time. Some of the volumes were actually glued binding, which really bugged me. But everything, there's very few double-page spreads and the like, so it's not a big loss. So there's that. Speaking of big hardbacks, quite a while ago I got my, what do they call it? It doesn't say on here, but they were calling it the Giant Oversized version of the Incal, and this is actually a box. It's a boxed hardback, and then you slide it out, and you have this cover instead. And here for a reference, there's the cover of the usual American volume, all-in-one volume, which is smaller. But when they said, and I guess this is about the same size as the Sixth Gun, is it? When they said giant size, oh no, the Sixth Gun is a bit taller and thinner, when they said giant size, I thought it would be even bigger, because what this actually does is restore the comic to the original size it was printed in France, the album size, and I thought it would be even bigger than that. So I was a little disappointed, but now that I have time to think about it, I'm less disappointed. And this includes lots of, I think it has an extra story in it and some other extra material. And it too is actually on beautiful matte paper, which I think does change the nature of the colors. I'm not, let's see, that's page 140. I wonder if 140 will be the same in here. Yeah. Well, the difference in the colors is kind of subtle, I think. But there is a difference in the colors from the change in the paper. I don't know. It's not too big of a difference. For some reason, I thought it was a bigger difference. So I'm glad to have this volume, but I have to say, when they said oversized, I thought really massive, because I've been getting these massive, a lot of large books from Marvel and stuff at the time I ordered it. And here's another oversized book, but a lot less oversized. The first hardback of the Immortal Hulk, which contains the first 10 issues. Again, comparing it to the normal comic book size, it's just a touch bigger. A very subtle touch bigger. Leave it to Marvel to not go too far, at least at first, although Marvel has those wonderful oversized Jack Kirby stuff. And this was a $35 book, and sadly, glued binding. Other than that, it's quite a beautiful book, and even a little bit of extra real estate makes me enjoy even more the Joe Bennett artwork. This is kind of Joe Bennett's peak as an artist, I think, on this book, and possibly Al Ewing's peak. I still kind of compare this, that Al Ewing and Joe Bennett are doing what Alan Moore and his team of artists like Rick Veitch and Steve Bissett and Alfredo Alcala and John Totalbein did for the Swamp Thing. And this is still ongoing. I imagine eventually I'll buy a slightly bigger omnibus of it. I'm kind of become a sucker for the Immortal Hulk. I just keep buying stuff. You may have seen me getting those director's cuts, which came out weekly, and there were 6 issues of it. I should talk about it again. I kind of took a look at issue 1. So, and the last cool thing about this is underneath the dust jacket is one of these right on the hardcover pieces of artwork, and they made a very cool choice with this intense close-up of the Hulk. So I really like that. I don't feel like you need dust jackets at all, but I know that for hardback book collectors, the dust jacket's very important. So I'm in a dilemma where I want to just throw away my dust jackets because I like the raw hardcover better, but I know I shouldn't in case I want to resell them. And I don't know how to store the dust jackets without the book and not have them get all out of whack. Okay, and then another thing I got was something called Write Your Own Marvel. And when I ordered it, I had no idea it would be this size. Let's again compare it to a standard comic book size. So it's kind of tiny. And I got it for like 44% off, but the cover price is $15 for this little thing. And what it is just pages, but not real pages, like panels, I guess, moved around with the dialogue removed, and you're supposed to write the dialogue in yourself. It's kind of odd that the dialogue is different colors. I don't think it was originally in this Avengers 4 that we're showing here. So I thought that was a cool, fun, goofy idea. If it were twice as big, I could imagine myself trying to letter some dialogue in, but that is really small. I'm not that good of a letterer to begin with, but to have so little space to work with. And I'm not sure why they chose these kind of... Each page seems to have some random panels from an issue, and then each double-page spread has some random panels for an issue, not even consecutive. And then the next 2 pages are something else. So it's an interesting idea that I think they did not put together in the best possible way. It could make some goofy fun. I remember when I was a kid and I was getting fanzines that I would order from the Comics Buyer's Guide, there were some fanzines where they redrew or kind of traced panels of like the Fantastic Four and traced the word balloons and then put their own words in the word balloons to make them kind of fanish jokes about the comic. Like I always remember one where someone had done that with an image of Lockjaw biting into a piece of metal a metal girder that the Thing was holding and putting in funny dialogue from the Thing and Lockjaw maybe. So yeah, and that would be, we could easily, I guess, scan in pages of comics and then use Photoshop or something to remove the dialogue and do this ourselves. So yeah, like it's not real continuity, but it's also not like, maybe they should have just put one panel per page and you could have made them, like I was talking about in those fanzines, a one panel joke thing where you make up your own dialogue. Or give us a few whole stories and we could make up a whole story Stan Lee style to go with the art that's already there. That's probably what I would really like to do. And speaking of art, I got the Marvel art of Esad Ribic. Sadly, it's not a hardback, and but it's full of color, lots of cool art examples of stuff he's done, stuff I'd forgotten he'd done, like Silver Surfer Requiem. There's a little bit of process stuff in here, not a lot. Sadly, there's none of his Conan cover work or other stuff. I guess that's too recent to fit in here. Or maybe there's copyright issues there. I don't know. But definitely a cool book to have. And this one, ironically, they sent me 2 copies when I ordered it. So I was able to give a copy of this to a friend who loves Marvel Comics. So it's fun to look through. I do like to have these art books in hardback when possible. And here's an odd thing in terms of art books. It's the art of comic book inking, but it's a how-to inking book written by Gary Martin. And so it has sections on all the elements of inking. And this is talking about inking over comic book pencils, of course. And so that's quite interesting. And but in the beginning, in the intro, which I read, and then in a little comic he has, he's basically saying this book is for 3 groups of people, just comic aficionados, but really it's for people who want to become inkers, or people who are inkers who want to refine their knowledge of inking, or most importantly, editors at comic book companies, so they will understand inking. Go away. And then there's this cartoon that's making a joke on Marvel editors who don't know much about inking. He doesn't call them Marvel, he calls them Marvy. But I was a bit surprised at his balls of putting this in. Is he never going to work for Marvel again? This is published by Dark Horse. And then later in the book, you get examples of... There's a penciled page. This one's Nexus. And then you get examples of all these different inkers' versions of that page. The striking thing, like particularly on this Nexus one, is the different versions don't look that different. I think there's something so pure about Steve Rude's pencils that most inkers make the same choice on it. And maybe, well, there's Tom Palmer. I couldn't tell that's inked by Tom Palmer. Maybe it's that these are all modern inkers who do more of a working over very complete pencils and being very careful not to offend the penciler who's the one who hires them, as opposed to the old days when the pencilers would be all upset when the inker put their style all over the inked pages. But for me, it would have been more interesting if there was the changes between these. Even P. Craig Russell there, is very subtle differences. But each person writes some notes or an essay about their approach to inking next to the page they inked. So I thought that was very cool. And there's another Steve Rude, and it's even inked by Brian Boland, which surprised me, because I don't think of him as an inker. And then inked by Rudy Nebrez, who I guess died while this book was being made, sadly, so the book is dedicated to him. Rudy Nebrez inks actually do look distinctive. Kevin Nolan. So it's an odd book, and then there's a lot of things doing a Dark Horse character called Ghost. If you look at those pencils, they almost look like they're inked already. Those are pencils by Brent Anderson. They're very complete pencils. It feels like you could just darken them in Photoshop and use them, I would think. But so we get Gary Martin inking it, and then very interesting to me, Steve Lealoha. I don't know how to pronounce it. Lealoha? I'm not sure, but I always loved his inks back in the Bronze Age. I didn't even know he was still around inking. This is like the most recent edition of a book that was first put out in the 90s. There's a Mike Royer inking it. So they're all just faithful to that. It just seems like an odd choice. Brent Anderson's own inks of his pencils are the most unique, have the most style. So it kind of tells you something a little bit sad to me about the modern state of inking, where, it's nice for the penciler that their style isn't ruined, but I think it's a much more interesting art form when the pencils were a lot rougher and a lot more choices were done by the inker. The one that really stands out, okay, they also do a Conan one. Not a Conan, it looks like Conan, but a Jack Kirby one, doing some kind of barbarian. But then a Conan by Gil Kane. Now there's a lot. This looks like a familiar cover too. I'm surprised the pencils still exist, from maybe a giant size Conan or something. So here, on this very rough drawing by Gil Kane, then you get to see a lot of stylistic choices and changes. And even more interesting was there's this, that very much looks like a Xerox. So an old Xerox of a John Buscema page, John Buscema Conan page, probably from the, I don't know, in the 50s or something of the early Conan run. So now we get a lot of differences in style over that. There's a good example. Even there, though, the inkers aren't taking a lot of risks here. Wow, this one's really dark by John Beatty. The other interesting thing about this is it includes blue line reproductions of some pencils for you to ink yourself. I think they're the same ones that the pros inked in this comic, at least some of them. So there's the Nexus page. It's weird because a whole bunch of them are of Dark Horse's Ghost, and they all look about the same. There's the Gil Kane page, though. Do I dare, in my total amateurishness, try to ink one of these pages? Do I need to buy 2 copies of this book, or maybe 3? It'd be kind of cool to buy a whole book of just master pencils that you could ink over and over again. Still can't get over that they can't find the John Buscema page, but I know it's in here. Anyway, so that's a really kind of cool, unique book, even though, there's things I would want that it doesn't do. Last but not least, let's see, get these in the right order. I bought a bunch of Freak Brothers comics. There is number 5. These are reprint comics. I think some of them may contain 2 issues in one. I got all of these once upon a time when I was in college at a head shop in downtown in my college town, and since long lost them, and never thought about getting them again, to tell you the truth, until Matt said, hey, do you want to do a podcast about the Freak Brothers? The furry Freak Brothers are usually called, or Fabulous Freak Brothers. So that's issue 2. So I don't know how these match up with the original issues in terms of whether they have the same content or a mix of content from various things. Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers, that's the proper name. That is issue number 4. I got these from mycomicshop.com because I don't see these lying around the comic shops anymore. But there was a time, I'm pretty sure, where the Freak Brothers were the best-selling underground comics. And I feel like I saw, numbers in the hundreds of thousands of copies. And they would just keep reprinting them over the years and keep selling them at head shops. And eventually, I think there were collections, too. There's number 6. And I always loved the little Fat Freddy's cats strips at the bottom. So we'll see what I think of it now, since I haven't read these since I was 19 or 20. There is issue number 9. So I want to dig into these. I haven't even cracked them open to look at what they look like on the inside. I have a feeling back in 1980 I never read issue number 9, but maybe not. I remember buying a lot of these at the head shop. And basically the Freak Brothers in my memory are guys who love marijuana. And they live, I don't know if they're dealers, but they live, oh, this one's in color. Are they all in color? That would be surprising to me. Let's go back to number 2. Crack that one open. I couldn't do a short video, could I? Yeah, these are in black and white. So I don't think I ever read any in color before. I'll have to check out the dates and stuff. And I'm guessing a lot of these were originally printed in underground newspapers and then reprinted in these comics. When you look at that, it looks like it was meant to be printed on a newspaper size page. Gilbert Shelton, I think he also did the, what was the name of that character? Embarrassing when I can't remember the name of the character. He was a joke on Superman and superheroes in general. One of the other major underground characters, and I feel stupid for not remembering them. So now that Matt brought these back into my attention, I'm kind of psyched to reread these, or some of them probably read for the first time. And speaking of underground comics, the other thing I did a while back, also maybe in the same order, was get what I'd never bought before, because I always thought in my head, I guess from when I was a kid, that these were wildly expensive. These 2 Spirit comics, adults only, published by Kitchen Sink Comics before, in the very early 70s, before they started reprinting the Spirit elsewhere, like at Warren Comics. And then, ironically, later, Kitchen Sink picked up the Warren, where the Warren left off on the Spirit reprints. So I had thought that this would be a mix of new and old comics. But on the inside, it's mostly old comics. Maybe I've only looked through issue number 1, but there we got reprints of some classic stuff, and not, these same ones are reprinted, I believe, in the Warren comics and look nicer there. So you get a new cover, and I think you get some, oh, and this one is different. In the other one, you got some one-page Spirit cartoons. It looks like in this one, you get some kind of updated 4-page Pagel comic done in a very different style than Will Eisner's usual Spirit. Stuff that looks much closer to his later graphic novels. I don't think he'd started the graphic novels by 1971 or whenever this came out. So you get a little bit of original stuff. And this one, number 1, takes a different tack and gives you 1-page gag comics that were new at the time from Will Eisner. And then a lot of reprints. Definitely good stuff, and it was probably great at the time, and probably introduced Will Eisner to the people who were new to comics via underground comics. So I'm still glad to have them, and they weren't that expensive, but I did have high expectations for these of being like 50% new material, or maybe even more than 50% new material. Okay, well, that's it for this very long video. See how I turn a short week into a long video? Talk to you all later.